I want to welcome all of you here to this program. You've heard that so far this morning that Europe has gone to hell, that America is going to hell, and that the terrorists are out there. I'm going to be addressing the subject, does the Constitution matter any longer? No. And so there is one more piece of dour state of affairs, but I'm going to end on a high note, so don't leave. The question, does the Constitution matter anymore, has been brought to the fore, particularly, of course, by the process that has culminated in Obamacare. When we see the Congress of the United States telling states that they must set up these exchanges and telling individuals that they must buy a product from a private vendor, failing which they will be taxed or fined, then it seems that there is nothing that Congress cannot do. And indeed, you ask members of Congress if that is the case, and they're hard-pressed to find there is anything that they can't regulate or anything that they can't redistribute. And so this is the state of affairs that we've come from. And that is coming from a document that was written largely by a man, James Madison, who wrote in Federalist 45 that the powers of the new government would be few and defined. I dare say no one in this room believes the government's powers today are few and defined. So how did we get from that to where we are today? Well, I see a lot of faces that I recognize in the audience today who have heard me discuss this many times and probably can give the talk themselves. So I'm going to try to put a somewhat different spin on it. What I'm going to do is talk about the Declaration of Independence and the vision that it has, show how that is captured by the Constitution, how, in other words, the bare bones vision of the Declaration frames our whole approach to government in this country, and then show how it is that during the Progressive and New Deal era, we fundamentally changed that. And so I want to give you a conception of how the libertarian and to some extent the conservative approaches these issues, which is very different from the way the modern liberal approaches it. So you'll have a conception of how these two Weltanschauungs, as it were, go together or don't go together, and how we've gotten to the state of affairs that we're at today. Now you look at the Declaration and you see that in those famous phrases that begin, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," that there are two parts in those very sparse phrases. There is the moral vision, first of all, and then there is the political legal vision. And it's important to recognize the difference between those two, because what you've got is Jefferson, who penned that, standing in the state of nature tradition. That is to say, he's trying to show how you can justify government and governmental powers by starting with the state of affairs without government, in order to avoid begging the question. And so he starts with the simplest of all premises: all men are created equal. And he defines that with reference to our rights, not virtues or values or other moral notions, but rights. And the idea that each of us has a right to pursue happiness by his own values as he works his way through life. In other words, it is a starting point, simple as could be, with individuals, each with a right to plan and live his own life. Now, the next question is, we don't, of course, live in a world in which it's just individuals. They come together in various ways. So we get to the second great question: how do they come together legitimately? The first starting point is that each of us has his right to his life, his liberty, and to right to pursue happiness. And that is all reducible, as John Locke said, to property, broadly understood as lives, liberties, and estates. Now we come to that second step: contract. So those are your two basic rights: property, broadly understood as lives, liberties, and estates, and contract or promise, the way we come together legitimately. And through these two rights, we can create the whole of what we call civilization or civil society, even before we have talked about government. So what we're getting clear about, first of all, is the moral order. Each of us with a right to plan and live his life. In other words, to be free, to live his life without the interference of other people. Now we've got the question, well, how are we going to secure this? And so we move to the second stage, and that's where oftentimes libertarians have difficulty. They have no difficulty usually setting forth the first, the moral order, and all that is entailed by it. But when you get into the issue of how do you secure this moral order, that's when all the compromises have to come up. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the idea is that it's twice limited government. First of all, it's limited by its ends to secure our rights and the means which must be consented to. But there are lots of trade-offs and compromises that have to be established along the way. For example, you can think of a continuum. Down here is anarchy, no government at all. Up here is totalitarianism. Along that continuum, you can have various combinations of government power and individual liberty. And if it's all a matter of consent, then it turns out you've got some problems justifying it because you've got majorities, for example, saying we want this much government and minorities saying no, and you've got the problem of the tyranny of the majority. And so this, you want to think of it along this continuum model. Now, they thought about it in 1787 when they drafted the Constitution. And you see that Madison started right out the same way, state of nature theory, we the people for the purposes listed do ordain and establish this Constitution. Excuse me. In other words, they started without government, so to speak, in this theoretical state of affairs. And then you look at the body of the Constitution and you see how much government they gave us. And you see they started out by saying all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. By implication, not all power was herein granted. And you look at Article 1, Section 8, and you will see that Congress was given just 18 powers. That's all. They wanted a limited government. And then when they got to the 10th Amendment, the last documentary evidence, they made that very explicit. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, and here's the key, the Constitution establishes a government of delegated, enumerated, and thus limited powers. If there is no power in the Constitution, the government does not have a right to engage in that activity. It couldn't be more simply stated than this. If you want to limit power, don't give it in the first place. So there's your theory of legitimacy. The power is legitimate if and only if it has been given by the people as recognized in the document itself. And then a Bill of Rights was added 2 years later to make it clear that these are some of the things that government cannot do as it goes about exercising its various powers. It can't abridge freedom of the press, freedom of religion. It's got to respect your right to be free from various intrusions of privacy and so on and so forth. It can't take your property without just compensation and on and on. Now, we lived under that limited government pretty much for the next 150 years. It wasn't perfect. There was slavery, for example, that was obliquely recognized. The framers understood that. They hoped it would wither away. It didn't. It took a civil war and the passage of the Civil War amendments, which finally applied the Bill of Rights against the states. So now you had, as it were, the completion of the Constitution. So what happened? Well, what happened was the Progressive Era at the end of the 19th and into the 20th centuries, where there was a fundamental shift in the climate of ideas. Last night you heard George Will talking about Woodrow Wilson. This was the elites of the Northeast, coming from the elite universities, who were fundamentally rethinking government. It was no longer to be a necessary evil. It was to be an instrument to solve all manner of social and economic problems. It was to be generally an institution through which to engage in social engineering. Of course, the only problem was that the Constitution stood athwart that kind of effort. And during the early decades of the 20th century, the court, for the most part, not entirely, found that much of what was being proposed by the progressives was unconstitutional. But there were inroads being made. Things came to a head, however, during the New Deal, especially after the landslide election of 1936. After that, Roosevelt threatened to pack the court with 6 new members. There was the famous switch in time that saved 9, and the court began literally turning the Constitution on its head. In 1937, it got rid of this doctrine of enumerated powers, the very centerpiece of the Constitution, and then in 38, it gave us two levels of judicial review and two kinds of rights, fundamental and non-fundamental. So now you had the modern liberal version, whereas the older conservative for the most part, but libertarian especially vision, was one in which you had government authorized by the people and limited only to those powers that were given it. Now you had a conception whereby, with the demise of the doctrine of enumerated powers, government could pretty much regulate and redistribute at will. The role of the courts was to carve out little areas where the government could not act, like speech, like religion, like certain kinds of privacy, and so on and so forth. So there are your two fundamental conceptions. Today, we live primarily under that second conception as a result of the New Deal revolution. In other words, most liberals today, and some conservatives as well, think of the Constitution as a government that essentially gives Congress all the power that should be needed to give us health care, to give us retirement security and so forth, except for those narrow areas that are carved out. The older vision is the one that says that the government has only these powers, the rest is freedom for the individual. And those are the two fundamental conceptions. I'm going to leave you with a fundamental development that is taking place today. I allude to, of course, the Tea Party movement. What are they saying? Give us back our Constitution. They know, even though they don't understand it in detail, that something is fundamentally wrong in the land today. They feel it in their bones. That's why they say, give us back our Constitution. And we have seen in elections, from New Jersey to Virginia to Massachusetts to Utah and so forth, that this movement is very real, it is alive and well, and there is hope. And so that's the message I want to leave you with. Thank you.